Before dawn of September 1, 1939, clouds of bombers and fighters flew eastward into the skies over Poland, raining death and destruction on helpless towns and villages, on airfields, railroads, bridges, and factories. From East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and Slovakia grey-clad armies poured across the frontiers into the doomed country. The greatest of wars was on, a war which was, in the end, to involve the whole world in one vast conflagration. How did it happen that a generation still healing the deep wounds of the War of 1914-18 permitted this second and more terrible war to come? The explanation was to be found in the breakdown of the system of collective security and the growth of international anarchy, moral and political, in the post-World War I years. Across the seas, unappreciated by the average American, there had arisen a new threat to peace, to law, and ultimately, to American security. This was totalitarianism, as expressed in the political organization of Italy, Germany, and Japan. The essence of totalitarianism was the subordination of all individual or social interests to the interests of the master race, as represented in the state. Its object, the division of the world into spheres of influence, each sphere to be controlled by a master nation. Its method, the ruthless use of force. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had inaugurated the first totalitarian state in 1922. Adolf Hitler, who became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, improved greatly on the Italian model. Japan, long inured to despotism, fell increasingly under the control of reactionary military leaders who, with Emperor Hirohito's active compliance, ruthlessly suppressed all political opposition and preached the doctrine of Japanese racial superiority and the nation's sacred mission to free Asia of contaminating Western influences. Early in the 1930s, the first of these totalitarian nations felt strong enough to strike. Determined to establish its hegemony in the Far East, Japan invaded Manchuria in September 1931, crushed Chinese resistance, and a year later, set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. The United States protested and the League of Nations condemned the aggression, but Japan ignored the American protest, withdrew from the League, and prepared to extend its Asian conquests in order to end its economic dependence on white Western powers. The moral was not lost on other discontented nations. Throughout the 1920s, Germany had wrestled with the economic disorganization and social demoralization that followed its defeat in World War I, and the crisis was, by 1930, acute. German democracy seemed unable to cope with this crisis, but Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist, Nazi, party promised relief from economic ills, escape from the bondage of the Versailles Treaty, and the union of the entire German race under one strong government. In 1933, the aged President Paul von Hindenburg was persuaded to appoint Hitler, a transplanted Austrian and failed artist, to the chancellorship, and within a few months all opposition leaders were in jail and the National Socialist Party had an iron grip on the political and military machinery of the country. Hitler moved swiftly to consolidate his position and implement his promises. Determined to make Germany the greatest military power in the world, he contemptuously withdrew from both the Geneva Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations and embarked upon a full-scale program of rearmament. And, as if to dramatize his dissociation from the moral standards of the Western world, he invoked the discredited doctrine of Aryan superiority to justify a reign of terror against the Jews. Meanwhile, Mussolini, the founder of Fascism, thought the time was now ripe to re-establish the Roman Empire of ancient days. Ethiopia, which blocked the way from Italian Libya to Italian Somaliland, seemed an easy victim to start on. Early in 1935, Mussolini persuaded the slippery French premier, Pierre Laval, to consent to an Italian conquest of Ethiopia, and during the winter of 1935-36 that conquest was consummated. Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian emperor, appealed to the League of Nations, but he was powerless to stop Italy. On March 7, 1936, when the conquest of Ethiopia was all but complete, Hitler ordered his army into the demilitarized Rhineland, an audacious move to retake Germany's traditional Aryan territories and a flagrant violation of the Versailles Treaty. The French, with the strongest army in the world, offered no resistance. The identity of interest of these two totalitarian states was shortly dramatized in one of the great crises in the history of modern democracy, the Spanish Civil War. In 1931, the Spanish people had overthrown their decrepit monarchy and established a republic. The following years were troubled by escalating conflict between conservative and radical groups. The election of February 1936 placed the left-wing Popular Front coalition government in uneasy control of the nation, but reactionary groups still commanded the support of the church, the great landowners, and the army, led by General Francisco Franco. The nationalists, as these reactionary groups came to be known, revolted, and in midsummer 1936 Spain was plunged into a ferociously fought civil war that had much the same relation to World War II that the Kansas struggle of the 1850s had to the American Civil War. The governments of Great Britain and France failed to appreciate the implications of this war, or feared that intervention might lead to a widening of the conflict, which would involve all Europe. Communist Russia alone actively supported the beleaguered Spanish Republic, but its support further discouraged the timid governments of the democracies. So while Germany and Italy, fearing the triumph of Bolshevism in Spain, hurried hundreds of planes and tens of thousands of volunteers into the nationalist camp, Britain and France adopted a policy of non-intervention, and the United States Congress clamped an embargo on the shipment of munitions to either side. These divergent policies ultimately decided the outcome of the war, and a nationalist dictatorship was set up under General Franco in 1939. Once more, it was Japan's turn. In July 1937, the Guandong Army invaded China. Immensely superior in armaments, the Japanese swept from victory to victory, overrunning most of northern China and all the important seaports. After taking the walled city of Nanking in December 1938, Japanese soldiers slaughtered over 200,000 military prisoners of war and unarmed civilians, raping, castrating, and beheading tens of thousands of them, in what has been called a hidden Holocaust. To the entire world, the Japanese served notice that this was the new meaning of Bushido, the medieval code of the Japanese warrior that originally called for compassion toward one's enemies. The pattern and the menace of totalitarian conquest were becoming clear enough, yet the democracies, unprepared to risk war, continued to follow a policy of appeasement. Taking advantage of this, Nazi Germany moved swiftly to achieve three major objectives: the reincorporation into a greater Germany of all German peoples, the control by Germany of Middle Europe and the road to the Middle East, and the erection of a totalitarian barrier against communism. Already in 1936 Hitler had called into existence the Rome-Berlin Axis, an anti-communist alliance which shortly embraced Japan, Italy, Spain, and Hungary. He then began a policy of territorial aggrandizement. Austria was the logical place to begin. It was small and defenseless, and its population was almost entirely German-speaking. In March 1938, the blow fell. While Britain and France held feudal conferences, a Nazi fifth column in Austria took control of the army and the police. The Austrian Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg, who had resisted Nazi aggression to the last, abdicated, and on the night of March 11 the German mechanized army sped across the border, and the union of Austria and Germany was formally announced. A triumphant Hitler rode like a king through the neighborhoods where he had once lived as a struggling artist in miserable flophouses. And SS officials and Viennese Nazis launched a wild urban pogrom against the Jews. G.E.R. Gedai, the veteran British correspondent in Vienna, described a city taken over by Hitler thugs wearing brown shirts and marching menacingly behind enormous swastika flags. It was an indescribable witches' Sabbath. Stormtroopers, lots of them barely out of the schoolroom, with cartridge belts and carbines, the only other evidence of authority being swastika brassards, or marching side by side with police turncoats, men and women shrieking or crying hysterically the name of their leader, embracing the police and dragging them along in the swirling stream of humanity, motor lorries filled with stormtroopers clutching their long-concealed weapons, hooting furiously, trying to make themselves heard above the din, men and women leaping, shouting, and dancing in the light of the smoking torches which soon began to make their appearance, the air filled with a pandemonium of sound in which intermingled screams of "Down with the Jews! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Sieg Heil! Perish the Jews! Hitler's power in Germany was now absolute, his popularity with the German people overwhelming. He had restored the confidence of a shaken and badly divided nation, wiped out the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, pulled Germany out of a paralyzing economic depression, and won a succession of territorial conquests without shedding a drop of German blood. That this was accomplished by the complete suppression of civil liberties, the crushing of leftist political parties, and a vicious policy of ethnic cleansing against the Jews, was seen by most as at least a price worth paying, writes historian Ian Kershaw, by many as positively welcome. Before the democracies had recovered from the shock of the Anschluss, or incorporation of Austria, Hitler moved against Czechoslovakia, demanding the cession of the Sudetenland, along the German border, home to more than 3 million ethnic Germans. Throughout the spring and summer of 1938, Hitler stormed at the hapless Czechs while he alternately threatened and cajoled their allies, Britain and France. Finally, at the Munich Conference of September 29 to 30th, Britain and France abandoned the little democracy to her fate. "I bring you peace with honor," said Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain on his return to London. "I believe it is peace for our time." Writing to his sister, Chamberlain declared that, "In spite of the harshness and ruthlessness I thought I saw in Hitler's face, I got the impression that he was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word." In March 1939, Hitler proved Chamberlain both a poor prophet and a poor judge of character, sending his army into Czechoslovakia, and while Britain and France looked helplessly on, dismembering that country. Back in the United States, Senator Albert Borer, a strident isolationist, explained to Congress that this was not a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and as if to confound him, Mussolini 3 days later seized Albania. In May, the two totalitarian leaders concluded a formal military alliance, directed against France and Britain. Then the German Führer turned on Poland, demanding the return of territory it had been forced to cede to Poland by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the Polish Corridor, a wide stretch of land, inhabited mostly by Germans, that cut off East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Convinced now that Hitler wanted war, England and France attempted to repair the damage of prolonged appeasement. But the diplomatic Humpty Dumpty had had so great a fall that it was impossible to put it together again. France distrusted Britain, and Britain France, and both with reason. Russia had lost confidence in both of them. The smaller nations could not fail to read the moral of Munich and of Prague. Yet Britain and France pushed ahead. They offered to guarantee Poland against aggression, though they failed conspicuously to indicate how they proposed to do this. As if to test the realism of the British, Russia proposed an alliance on the understanding that she be permitted to march troops into Poland and to take the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia into protective custody. Acquiescence in this proposal might have exposed the British government to the charge of insincerity in its zeal for the welfare of the non-aggressor nations, and the proposal was rejected. Russia then turned to Germany, and on August 23 the two great antagonists concluded a non-aggression pact, which freed Germany to seize Poland without risking war with Russia. Though there was a strong faction in both Britain and France that advocated further appeasement, this time the two governments did not back down. Hitler renewed his demands on Poland, but when he offered to guarantee the British Empire in return for a free hand in Poland, the British refused, informing him that they had obligations to Poland that they intended to honor. Hitler was unimpressed. "Our enemies are small worms," he told his generals. "I saw them in Munich." On the morning of September 1, 250,000 German soldiers stormed across the Polish border, and 1,600 Luftwaffe aircraft smashed Polish towns and cities. Hitler issued no declaration of war, claiming Germany had been attacked by Poland. On September 3, millions of people in the Western world, their radios alert to every step in the unfolding tragedy in Europe, heard the grave but firm voice of Neville Chamberlain announcing that Britain, in fulfillment of her commitments, was at war with Germany. That same day, reluctantly, France too went to war. And with the single exception of Ireland, the British Commonwealth of Nations rallied to the support of the mother country. The war Hitler had hoped to confine to a series of episodes was underway, and the great combination against him was already beginning to be formed. Hitler's counterattack on Poland has on this Sabbath day become a world war, William L. Shire, the CBS newscaster, wrote in his diary. To record that date, September 3, 1939. Shire was in Berlin's Wilhelmplatz when the announcement was made over the loudspeakers that England had declared war on Germany. A small crowd of people was standing there. When the announcement was finished, there was not a murmur, he wrote. They just stood there as they were before. Stunned. The people cannot yet realize that Hitler has led them into a world war. There was, he said, not even any hate for the French and the British, despite Hitler's various proclamations to the people, accusing the English warmongers and capitalistic Jews of starting this war. The Allies had a larger combined army than Germany and a far stronger navy, but Hitler's army was more highly mechanized, with 5 crack panzer divisions, and Germany's industrial prowess was only second to that of the United States, a non-belligerent. Germany also had a heavy advantage in air power and had developed its air arm as a lethal offensive weapon. And while France and England had largely maintained their peacetime economies right into 1939, the entire Nazi war machine had been preparing for a lightning offensive strike for 6 years. Poland had no time to organize its defense, nor did France or England have time to come to its aid. So Poland fought alone. The conquest of Poland was swift, violent, and overwhelming, a stunning revelation of the potentialities of mechanized, Blitzkrieg warfare and a dress rehearsal for action in the West. Within a week the Nazis had broken through to the defenses of Warsaw. Within a month the Poles had capitulated, and the fighting was over. The Nazis had massed 1.5 million men, nearly 2,000 tanks, and over 4,000 planes for the invasion. Against this tremendous array the Poles were able to mobilize only some 22 infantry divisions, 8 cavalry brigades, a single motorized brigade, and perhaps 1,000 planes, most of them antiquated. The German campaign was planned with masterly skill, drawing on the audacious ideas of General Heinz Guderian, who envisioned a new kind of warfare using tanks, motorized infantry, mobile artillery, and fast-striking air power. 3 great armies converged on Warsaw, one from East Prussia, one from Pomerania, and one, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, from the south. Western Poland offered no natural barriers to an advancing enemy, no convenient defense line. Hopelessly outnumbered, the Poles fought heroically, sending in horsemen armed with swords and lances against massive German tanks until their defenses cracked. The New York Times Berlin correspondent, Otto D. Taliskas, who was expelled by the Nazis the following year, the year he won the Pulitzer Prize, describes what happened in the first week of the German campaign, with the German armies in Poland, September 11 having hurled against Poland their mighty military machine. The Germans are today crushing Poland like a soft-boiled egg. The Germans have proceeded not only with might and speed, but with method, and this bids fair to be the first war to be decided not by infantry, the queen of all arms, but by fast motorized divisions and especially by the Air Force. Today the German rule of the air is so complete that, although individual Polish planes may still be seen flying at a high altitude, the German army has actually abandoned the blackout in Poland. It is a strange sensation to come from a Germany thrown into Stygian darkness at night to a battlefront town like Lodz, as this correspondent did the night after the Germans announced its occupation, and find it illuminated although the enemy is only a few miles from the city. With control of the air, the Germans moved forward not infantry but their tanks, armored cars and motorized artillery, which smashed any Polish resistance in the back. As a purely military matter, the German army is the height of efficiency. The fall of Warsaw would not necessarily have spelled the end of Poland. But in the midst of the fight against the Nazi invader, a new situation arose. On September 17 the Russians, anxious now for their own defense, marched in from the east. Confronted with the Wehrmacht on the west, the Red Army on the east, Polish resistance collapsed. On September 28, as the battered remnants of Warsaw surrendered, Germany and Russia arranged the partition of Poland, which, as it had so many times before, disappeared from the map. Russia had the larger territory, but only 1/3 the population and few of the industrial resources in which Western Poland was so rich. But what Russia wanted was space in which to erect a barrier against a possible German attack. Even Eastern Poland was not enough. The following June, when the collapse of France had freed the Germans for further ventures, Russia took over the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. One other frontier gave the Russians concern, and to that, having secured themselves along the Baltic Sea, they now turned their attention. Finland. The Nazi conquest of Poland had made Joseph Stalin nervous. He was successful in building up a defense barrier from the Baltic to Romania. But he wanted to protect himself similarly in the north. When negotiations to gain territorial concessions from Finland failed, the Red Army invaded on November 30th. The world, which had expected an easy conquest, was shortly astonished at the ferocity of the Finnish defense. The Russians, unprepared for winter fighting, unfamiliar with the terrain, and underestimating the fighting ability of perhaps the most warlike people in Europe, suffered costly defeats. North of Lake Ladoga, the Finns cut 3 Russian divisions to pieces. At Suomussalmi 2 more divisions were wiped out. The American correspondent and author Virginia Cowles describes this battlefield of ice and snow, white forests and glassy lakes. Shortly after the Russian defeat, during the previous 7 weeks, over 100,000 Russian troops had crossed the frontier, in repeated attempts to cut Finland in two. But the Finns had repulsed the onslaughts with some of the most spectacular fighting in history. They had annihilated entire divisions and hurled back others 30 and 40 miles to the border from where they started. To understand how they did it, you must picture a country of thick snow-covered forests and icebound roads. You must visualize heavily armed ski patrols sliding like ghosts through the woods, creeping behind the enemy lines and cutting their communications until entire battalions were isolated, then falling on them in furious surprise attacks. In this part of Finland, skis outmaneuvered tanks, sleds competed with lorries, and knives even challenged rifles. We approached the village of Suomussalmi just as dawn was breaking, and here I witnessed the most ghastly spectacle I have ever seen. It was in this sector that the Finns, a few weeks previously, had annihilated 2 Russian divisions of approximately 30,000 men. The road along which we drove was still littered with frozen Russian corpses, and the forests on either side had become known as Dead Man's Land. Perhaps it was the beauty of the morning that made the terrible Russian debacle all the more ghastly when we came upon it. The rising sun had drenched the snow-covered forests, with trees like lace valentines, with a strange pink light that seemed to glow for miles. The landscape was marred only by the charred framework of a house, then an overturned truck and 2 battered tanks. Then we turned a bend in the road and came upon the full horror of the scene. For 4 miles the road and forests were strewn with the bodies of men and horses, with wrecked tanks, field kitchens, trucks, gun carriages, maps, books, and articles of clothing. The corpses were frozen as hard as petrified wood, and the color of the skin was mahogany. Some of the bodies were piled on top of each other like a heap of rubbish, covered only by a merciful blanket of snow. Others were sprawled against the trees in grotesque attitudes. All were frozen in the positions in which they had died. They were everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of grotesque wooden corpses, in the ditches, under the trees, and even in dugouts beneath the snow where they had tried to escape from the fury of the attack. After these costly defeats, the Russians abandoned the effort to drive through snow-bound wilderness and began a direct attack upon the Mannerheim Line, along the Karelian Isthmus. Here Russian superiority in manpower, artillery, and planes could make itself felt, and here, after 2 months of the hardest kind of fighting, a breakthrough was achieved. On March 12, Finland ceded to Russia all the lands demanded before the invasion. The cost to the Soviets was high, over 200,000 dead soldiers, compared to some 20,000 Finnish fatalities. The following month, Stalin ordered the massacre of almost all Polish officers captured by the Red Army in 1939. This was done secretly. The bodies of many of the victims were finally discovered in the spring of 1943 in the Katyn Forest, near Smolensk. Why had Stalin done this? Probably to make sure neighboring Poland remained weak in the post-war years by eliminating 15,000 anti-communist leaders. Meanwhile, Hitler began the systematic slaughter of Polish Jews, gypsies, and political undesirables. By the end of the war, 5.5 million Poles would be killed, most of them civilians, almost 16% of the population. Poland suffered the greatest human losses in the war. Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union followed, with 10% and 5% dead respectively. By early 1940, the world had begun to see that this war would be more barbaric than any civilized person might have imagined. Denmark and Norway in March, William Shirer confided to his journal Asterisk, "I hope I didn't put myself out on a limb, but from what I've heard this week I wrote tonight in my broadcast. Some people here believe the war may spread to Scandinavia yet. It was reported in Berlin today that last week a squadron of at least 9 British destroyers was concentrated off the Norwegian coast, and that in several instances German freighters carrying iron received warning shots. From here it looks as if the neutrals, especially the Scandinavians, may be drawn into the conflict after all." Shirer was not out on a limb. At 4 o'clock in the morning of April 9th, German armies poured across the unfortified frontier of Denmark, with whom the Germans had recently concluded a non-aggression pact. Denmark, however, was not to be conquered. It was to be a model protectorate, a laboratory of the new Nazi order. But even when on their good behavior, the Nazis were unable to conciliate the people of an occupied country. Soon the usual process of exploitation and looting began, and soon, too, the Danish resistance movement was organized and began its long and heroic campaign of sabotage. As German troops were marching across the Danish frontier, powerful elements of the German navy were steaming into every important Norwegian port: Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. The Norwegians were caught unprepared. Yet everywhere but at Narvik they put up a stout resistance, inflicting heavy losses. The Norwegian government had fled to Elverum, near the Swedish frontier, and the Nazis had established a new government under the leadership of Vidkun Quisling, whose name was soon to be a synonym throughout the world for traitor. German armies pushing rapidly northward from Oslo brushed aside fierce but unorganized resistance. Within a week the British had landed reinforcements, British, French, and Polish, but they were too little too late. The enemy controlled the sea lanes and air, and by the end of April the Allied forces, outnumbered and outpowered, were forced to withdraw. In just 2 months Hitler had conquered Denmark and Norway and had isolated Sweden. His policy of appeasement thoroughly discredited by Hitler's treachery, Chamberlain was forced to retire, and on May 10th a new government was formed under the leadership of Winston Churchill. He inspired the British people, and free peoples everywhere, with an implacable resolution to endure the worst that the Nazis could hurl against them and fight through to ultimate victory. It was entirely fitting that on the very day that Hitler launched his attack on the Low Countries, France, and ultimately Britain, he should be confronted by that indomitable man who, more than any other, was to be responsible for frustrating his wicked designs. The Low Countries. "The hour has come," Hitler told his army, "for the decisive battle for the future of the German nation. For 300 years the rulers of England and France have made it their aim to prevent any real consolidation of Europe and above all to keep Germany weak and helpless. With this your hour has come. The fight which begins today will decide the destiny of the German people for 1,000 years. Now do your duty." The army's imperative was to conquer Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, overrun France, and bring Britain to her knees. It was one of the great campaigns in military history. Holland and Belgium, mortally afraid of giving Germany any excuse to attack, had failed to mobilize their armies or coordinate their defenses with those of France. The French had dispersed their forces in the north, in the Maginot Line, and along the Italian frontier. The British were still frantically building up their army and air force. At early dawn, May 10th, the Germans struck all along the western front, from the North Sea to Luxembourg. The major attack rolled through the rugged Ardennes toward the Meuse River. Planes bombed helpless cities, parachutists seized airfields and bridges, fifth columnists spread confusion and terror behind the lines. The Dutch put up a stout resistance, but within 4 days most of Holland was in German hands. Then, while negotiations for the surrender were underway, the Luftwaffe bombed the center of Rotterdam, killing 814 civilians and leaving 80,000 homeless. the beginning of the wars, terror bombing, campaigns. Under the threat to subject every Dutch city to similar treatment, resistance ceased. The conquest of Belgium was equally swift. Meantime, Gerd von Rundstedt had broken through the Ardennes. This rugged forest-covered country, crisscrossed by winding roads and swift rivers, was thought to be unsuitable to mechanized warfare and was therefore lightly defended. It was assumed that it would take weeks for the Nazis to fight their way through here, and in that time the French could bring up the whole of their Ninth Army. But with Heinz Guderian's panzer columns in the lead, the Wehrmacht smashed through in 2 days, crossed the Meuse River, and sped toward the English Channel. It was a catastrophe of the first order. On May 21st, the Germans reached the English Channel at Abbeville, and the encirclement of the Belgians and the British Expeditionary Force was complete. On May 26, Lord Gort, commanding the BF, was authorized to re-embark his army to Britain, and began to concentrate his forces on the only remaining port, Dunkirk. At this juncture, the whole situation was altered, the entire BF threatened, by the unexpected surrender of the Belgian army. Dunkirk, the BF, as well as remnants of the French and Polish armies along the Channel, some 400,000 men, seemed doomed as the Germans closed the ring around them. But the sea was still open, and Britain still ruled the waves. With a valor that aroused the admiration even of the enemy, the French fought rearguard actions at Lille, Cassel, and in Dunkirk itself. A small British force held out with fanatical courage at Calais. Then came Operation Dynamo, or, as John Masefield has called it, the 9 Days' Wonder. The Germans pressed on Dunkirk from all sides. Their artillery subjected it to ceaseless pounding, their planes smashed at piers and docks and at the embarkation fleet. The town was aflame, the water supply gone, the docks a shambles. The Admiralty had already anticipated the task of re-embarking the army from France. When it became clear that the withdrawal could no longer be delayed, the word went out for the gathering of the ships. The most fantastic armada in history, numbering 665 civilian craft and 222 naval units, assembled in the British ports nearest Dunkirk. For 9 days the evacuation went on, from May 26 to June 3, and even on the 4th and 5th a few stragglers and last-ditch fighters were brought out. Arthur D. Devine, who took part in the whole operation, has described it. When I heard that small boats of all sorts were to be used at Dunkirk, I volunteered at once. The evacuation went on for over a week, but to me the most exciting time was the night before the last. I was given a motorboat about as long as my drawing room at home, 30 feet. She had one cabin forward and the rest was open, but she had twin engines and was fairly fast. For the crew we had 1 sub-lieutenant, 1 stoker and 1 gunner. For armament we had 2 Bren guns, 1 my own particular pet which I had stolen, and rifles. In command of our boat we had a real live Admiral Taylor, admiral in charge of small boats. We first went out to French fishing boats gathered off Ramsgate, boats from Caen and Le Havre, bright little vessels with lovely names, Ciel de France, Ave Maria, Grazia Plena, Jean Antoine. They went as the leaders of the procession, for they were slow. With them went dockyard tugs and towing barges. There were sloops, mine-sweepers, trawlers, destroyers. There were Thames fire floats, Belgian drifters, lifeboats from all around the coast, lifeboats from sunken ships. There was never such a fleet that went to war before, I think. As I went round the western arm of the harbor near sunset, passing out orders, it brought my heart into my throat to watch them leave. They were so small. Little boats like those you see in the bight of Sandy Hook fishing on a fine afternoon. When this armada of onments was under way, we followed with the faster boats, Royal Air Force rescue launches, picket boats, and the like. It was the queerest, most nondescript flotilla that ever was, and it was manned by every kind of Englishman, never more than 2 men, often only 1, to each small boat. There were bankers and dentists, taxi drivers and yachtsmen, longshoremen, boys, engineers, fishermen and civil servants. It was dark before we were well clear of the English coast. But even before it was fully dark we had picked up the glow of the Dunkirk flames. From a glow they rose up to enormous plumes of fire that roared high into the everlasting pall of smoke. The picture will always remain sharp-etched in my memory, the lines of men wearily and sleepily staggering across the beach from the dunes to the shadows, falling into little boats, great columns of men thrust out into the water among bomb and shell splashes. Some of the big boats pushed in until they were almost aground, taking appalling risks with the falling tide. The men scrambled up the sides on rope nets, or climbed hundreds of ladders.